LowDOWN. Next to podcast, Dr. Susan Fawcett gives us the lowdown on behavioral mental health treatments. Over to you, Hannah and Maria.
Thanks, Jody. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the LowDOWN podcast. I'm your host, Hina Mahmood, OT at the DSRF. For today's episodes, it's just going to be me. My fabulous co-host, Marla, is off on maternity leave for the remainder of the season, so I'm hoping to hold down the fort without her. Before we continue on with our episode, we would love for you to hit that subscribe button and leave a review of our podcast on your chosen platform. Remember to check out our episode pages for additional resources related to each episode. You can also follow the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation at www.dsrf.org and on Instagram and Twitter by following at DSRF Canada. So today we are taking another dive into the world of mental health. When we started this podcast, it was at the very beginning of this pandemic, almost a year ago today, actually, and we weren't even sure we would mention the pandemic during the interviews. We were kind of hoping that it would be done by then, but clearly I was wrong. But it has a way of kind of seeping into our everyday lives. One thing we know for sure is the impact this pandemic has had and continues to have on our mental health, and also the mental health of our clients with Down syndrome and their families. The lack of structure, routine, and increased isolation has made it very, very challenging. So today I have the pleasure of learning more about mental health treatment for people with Down syndrome from our 3-time guest on the LowDOWN, Dr. Susan Fawcett. She has been a guest on this podcast before, talking about the learning profiles of students with Down syndrome. Dr. Fawcett is, in fact, specialized in behavioral treatments for mental health. So today's discussion will focus on that area. Welcome, Susan. It was very weird calling you Dr. Fawcett there for a second, but it's a title well earned for sure.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you
to the podcast. Okay, so you know the grand old tradition of the LowDOWN where we were going to start with 5 secret questions. And so, yeah, and you have not seen these before, so this will be fun. Okay, are you ready?
I think I'm as ready as I can be.
As you can be?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, question number 1. What is your favorite book to use in therapy with a student?
Ooh, that is a good one. Do you know the one that immediately springs to mind is, I can't remember the exact title of it, but I do remember. Miss Nelson is Missing.
Oh, okay.
It's an oldie but a goodie.
Okay.
Where Miss Nelson, well, I won't go into very many details about
Spoiler
it, but
alert,
it is very funny and kids really love it. Okay. So yeah, that's definitely a good one.
Yeah.
Check it
I
out.
find that they do love all the funny books, like things where like weird things happen or, some,
Yes.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Mrs. Nelson is Missing. On my list. Question number 2. What is your go-to mindfulness practice?
Ooh, I think my absolute favorite one is a loving kindness meditation, because you can really, it's good for kind of, self-compassion, but also extending compassion to people with whom you might have difficult relationships with.
Oh, okay.
So it can be really helpful for that. And it's just a really lovely practice. You always end it and you're like, oh, I feel so much better.
Yeah.
So it's good.
So is it something that you can, is it something you download on your phone or is it online or is it written?
I think if you just put in Google or YouTube loving kindness meditation, a few would crop up. There's definitely ones on the Headspace and Calm apps as well.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Very cool. Okay. Question number 3. Imagine you have your own late night talk show. Who do you invite as your first guest?
Glenn Hoos.
Oh,
I feel like he'd be a great first guest. And I did that literally to see the expression on his face right now.
What would you talk to Glenn about? What kind of things could we talk
Glenn
about?
has many, many entertaining stories about escapades that happen in his own home.
Yes.
And I feel like that could be a fresh new perspective on a late night talk show.
Yeah. And for those of you that are listening that don't know who Glenn is, he is our producer extraordinaire and a parent of some pretty amazing kids. But yes, and I think he's going to also have an episode this season. So we'll find out all about those escapades that Susan is referring to on the episode on our family spotlight for season 3.
There, you should air it late at night and see how it does.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah, I think it might have to be like a midnight release or something. Okay, question number 4. You can have an unlimited supply of one thing for the rest of your life. What is it?
Oh, boy. I think it's a toss-up between 2 things that aren't very good for me, but I'm going to say them anyway. It would have to be either champagne or dark chocolate.
Oh.
Yeah, I'd be happy with either of those.
Dark chocolate's pretty good for you. Yeah.
I guess maybe not in an endless quantity, though.
Yeah. I mean, you can have the endless supply. It doesn't mean you have to eat it all at once.
And yet I would.
And then that you would. Okay, gotcha. Endless supply and endless temptation, right?
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Are you like a 70% dark chocolate person, or are you like me, you like to go up in the high 80s?
I would say I'm more the 70. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I do like a little bit of the creaminess.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very nice. Okay. Okay. And our last question, as I mentioned earlier that, we're all still kind of in the throes of this pandemic, and at the DSRF, we've really pivoted beautifully to providing services through telehealth for our kiddos. I want to ask you, what is the hardest part about working virtually for you? And then what is the easiest part?
Oh, the hardest part is definitely that I don't get hugs on a regular basis. And I don't get to give them. So I would say that's been really, really tough for sure. And just that kind of 3D interaction is just so much richer. But I will say, honestly, it has gone much better than I would have thought a year ago. And I know that's probably the case for all the therapists and teachers here. And so I think maybe the easiest thing is it's definitely a bit easier from you don't have to put out so many activities and clean them all up after, so either the parents have to do that on their end, which is maybe not so great for them. But it is kind of easier on our end. It's a bit easier to stay organized and move seamlessly from one session to the next. Yeah. And some of the online games are pretty darn fun. Yeah.
100%. Yeah, I agree. And I think I learned a lot about our students' abilities and how they can do so many things online that I would never have assumed if we'd seen them in person. So I learned a lot from that too.
Yeah, definitely.
Great.
They also know easily how to turn the session off if you're not entertaining enough.
100%.
That's been great.
Because that's happened to all of us multiple times where the laptop lid just gets closed and you're fresh out of luck. Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much for answering some of those questions.
They were great questions.
Oh, great. Okay, awesome. Okay, so let's kind of get down to business. So to start off today, I was hoping you could share with our listeners a bit about how you became interested in this area of practice. So specifically working on mental health with our individuals and for those that haven't heard your first episode or don't know you, so Susan is an SLP and went back to school to obtain her PhD in positive behavior support, but then has also taken an interest in mental health wellness for our families and especially for our clients. So can you tell us where that interest came from?
Yeah, so I think I might have said a little bit about this already, but essentially what went down is about 10 years into my tenure here as an SLP, I kind of felt like I had some of the speech and language and communication stuff down, but I couldn't get to that with a lot of the kids because they were engaging in problem behavior or because, parents couldn't work on it at home because the parents were so stressed out or the kids were in terms of mental health specifically, since that's mostly what we're talking about today. I would hear, I'd see these little kids who were, I remember specifically this one girl that I first met when she was about 6, and she was just like the most delightful little human being. And then, really happy and really confident and sure of herself and willing to do anything I would give her to do. And then when she hit her teens, she stopped using the mirror, because oftentimes when we're working on speech sounds, we use a mirror so that we can see our mouths properly. And she would just keep pushing it aside and wouldn't use it. And it finally came out, which she said one day, "I hate my face." And I was like, "Why do you hate your face? Your face is beautiful. Like, I love your face." And she said said something about Down syndrome, you know, and that was really heartbreaking.
Yeah, 100%.
And so there were a few of those kind of kids. And so that kind of like the fact that they were really having trouble with their self-esteem and, you know, I saw a couple kids who clearly had a lot of anxiety issues, or who went through this, you know, period of low mood or depression. And I just didn't know what to do to help them.
Yeah.
And so during my degree, I was really, really blessed to be able to work with Dr. Catherine Martinez at the Vancouver CBT Center. And I did a practicum with her for a couple of years where she taught me how to assess and intervene on some of these issues with kids and teens who have intellectual disabilities.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned that, you know, you've known the client you were talking about since 6 and at teen years. And often for a lot of typically developing people, you know, teen years is a tumultuous time and a lot of those challenges and mental health issues do creep up. But for this girl, it was something different. Like it was just her not wanting to have Down syndrome or not liking that she had Down syndrome. So it's kind of like a different, like, you know, a different issue than some of the other kids that
and you're absolutely right. All teens go through a period where they, you know, they have a little crisis of self-identity, right? And they have low self-esteem. That's very, very common. But this was very specific to how, you know, how she looked and that it was because she had Down syndrome. Yeah.
And then, like, was there, so you obviously saw a gap and a need that needs to be fulfilled in that area. That's why you kind of went towards not only your PhD in positive behavior support, but then the practicum at the CBT Center. So there wasn't a lot for our individuals with Down syndrome out there really specifically to help in this area, right? So that kind of,
there aren't a lot of psychologists out there who see kids with developmental disabilities. There are a few, and I can definitely provide some of those resources. You can provide them for your listeners for sure. But they're a little hard to come by. And even if they're around, they have long wait lists or, you know, that kind of thing. So, and there's definitely, you know, having somebody who knows Down syndrome really well, plus that knowledge, I think is probably fairly rare.
Yeah. And then, like, I mean, I can assume that there is like a connection too between, you know, behavior and mental health, like they go hand in hand, cyclical. So it's kind of cool that you had, you know, knowledge in both areas so you could see how one affects the other.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And often mental health issues will kind of show up as problem behavior in kids with Down syndrome, right? So it manifests as, you know, they just aren't behaving very well, but actually there's an underlying mental health issue at play.
And do you find that often? That happens quite often?
I mean, I think it's not uncommon.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so before we dive into the specifics of CBT and you tell us a little bit about it, can you talk about the prevalence of mental health issues in individuals with Down syndrome? Like, what are some of the more commonly occurring mental health challenges and why are they sometimes missed?
Sure, absolutely. So 30% of people with Down syndrome have a coexisting mental health diagnosis, and that is higher than the typically developing population, which is more in the neighborhood of 20%. Also keep in mind, though, and I'm sure this is not going to be unfamiliar to anybody at this point in a year-long pandemic, that we all go through periods where we feel depressed for a little while or we're feeling very anxious about something. So this is something that most people will experience at one point or another. The most common ones in kids with Down syndrome are also the most common in the typically developing population, and those are anxiety and depression. And if you go by age, so younger kids with Down syndrome are more likely to be diagnosed with what we call externalizing behavioural issues or mental health issues. And those are things like attention deficit disorder, sometimes with that hyperactivity component as well. Autism, we know, is really common in kids with Down syndrome. And certain types of anxiety can happen early as well. So separation anxiety disorder. I've also seen, I think we all have examples of this at DSRF as therapists and teachers, where there's actually a lot of specific phobias in kids with Down syndrome. So they will develop a really strong fear response to a specific thing. So the most common ones I've seen are dogs and needles. Those are definitely the two that I think I've seen the most. But definitely there's kids who are really afraid of the dark or really afraid of thunderstorms, and not just really afraid, but they have an intense emotional response to those things that's sort of out of proportion with the threat, the actual threat.
Got it.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's a bit different from being generally anxious or just kind of worried about things in general. And then if you think about later on as kids get a bit older, say into adolescence or early adulthood, other types of anxiety may start to crop up. This is one that we see quite a bit here is selective mutism. So that's where kids will talk at home, they're total chatterboxes at home with their parents. Yeah. But then when they go out into the community, they all of a sudden don't talk at all, or they don't talk much at school, for example. Generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety. And then another really common one is that as teens get older and start to transition into adulthood, there's a really risky period for the development of depression at that point.
Okay.
Yeah. And these diagnoses are missed. You're asking about why they're missed. So I would say there's probably two main reasons. One being our old friend / enemy, diagnostic overshadowing, right? Where, you take your child to a pediatrician or a physician because you're noticing some changes and they attribute it to Down syndrome alone. Yeah. And that unfortunately happens a lot. And in that case, I just urge parents to really be, good, strong advocates for your kids. And because you know your kid best, right? And if there's something that doesn't feel right. Yeah. And then also the symptoms of these disorders in people with Down syndrome look different than they do in typically developing people, right? So a teen who's typically developing may actually express the thought, like, I feel like a worthless person, right? Yeah. But a child with Down syndrome is not going to express that in most cases.
And why do you think that is? Like, is there a specific, like a language or comprehension issue? Like that's where you're noticing
likely linked to a limited expressive language ability, or actually even receptive language ability.
Okay.
So I think that's probably what it is. It doesn't mean that they don't have those feelings, but they may not be able to express them.
Got it. Okay.
They might, though, become you might see behavioral changes. So they might become more teary. They might become really quick to anger or very irritable. That's a really common one. They may stop. Another big one is if a child loves, karate class, and then all of a sudden they don't want to go anymore. Right? They just would rather stay at home on the couch. So, and then if there's regression in previously achieved skills, that likely doesn't happen at all in typically developing people with depression, but it can happen quite often in kids with Down syndrome. Yeah. And then what we were saying earlier about, anxiety definitely often manifests as problem behavior, and specifically avoidance behaviors around, a particular situation is really scary for me. Yeah. Right? Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about externalizing behaviors. Could you expand a little bit on that for our listeners? Like, what would an externalizing behavior look like versus an internalizing?
Right. So externalizing is when you can actually see the behaviors happening. So these are often the ones that are more distressing for parents and teachers and that kind of thing, because the kids are throwing things, or they're swiping things off tables, or they're hitting or kicking or yelling or those kinds of things. Internalizing is really just your mood state, right? Or how you're feeling on the inside of your body.
Got it.
So, and that's not as easy to see. And it's also not as disruptive for family life and for being successful. Well, it could be disruptive for being successful in school, but it's not disruptive in terms of, outwardly, the class, right? The class isn't disrupted by the child.
You can't see it.
You can't see it
easily.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yeah.
And is it like could an individual with Down syndrome that's struggling with externalizing as a young kid, and then it goes into like, can it change from externalizing to internalizing as they get older, or
yeah,
the way
so
around?
there is actually, I mean, I think we all notice this clinically.
Yeah.
We've noticed this for a while,
Yeah.
right? That those of us who have worked with these guys for a while, that the kids who are, you know, really aggressive or super hyper when they're little kids and quite disruptive tend to be the ones who develop things like depression later on. So it is a bit of a something you want to be aware of if your kid is engaging in some of those things. And actually, we've noticed it clinically, but there is now actually research that supports that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I can imagine parents that are listening, some of them might be starting to panic or worry a little bit, like, okay, my kid throws things. So is that going to mean that they're going to end up, you know, having to battle depression? So is there like I mean, there's some aspect of that kind of stuff that's very kids, like, you know, at any age, a kid would throw things or whatever, but there has to be like a line where now you're like, okay, now it's time to worry.
Yeah. So, I mean, you always want to, this is a, you know, thing that I think we all try to get across all the time, an idea that you always wanted to approach things preventatively.
Absolutely.
You want to intervene early, right? And if you can kind of get the problem behaviors reined in and get them in you know, more independent and in engaging in routines a bit more successfully and adaptive, more in doing more adaptive behaviors, then that's going to increase their self-esteem, which is going to lessen the chance that they're going to be depressed later on.
Yeah. And that's kind of where the positive behavior support strategies really do come in
when
place, because you're helping when they're young. Yeah. And I love that you said preventative, because a lot of the times some parents may think, well, no, my kid's fine. Yeah. But doesn't mean that they'll stay fine.
That's right.
Or that behavior may not emerge.
It's not a foregone conclusion either. It's not like, oh, my kid is, you know, very naughty and now I have to worry about them being depressed later. It's just a bit more likely. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it's not like, and now you're armed with that knowledge, so you can be on the lookout for signs of it.
Exactly. Yeah. And I know that even with anxiety, that it can show up in so many different ways. So it's not like your very standard anxiety. Like I've had students where they seem, you know, perfectly happy on the outside, but there is an internalization of anxiety where I see it in how they're doing an activity, or, you know, how they're very perfectionist sometimes. Like they need to, you know, if they make a mistake, they're going to get anxious, so it shows differently than what you would typically think an anxious person would display. Yeah. Great.
Definitely.
Awesome. That was really, really helpful. And I'm sure it's going to be very helpful for a lot of people listening. So kind of as parents are thinking about this and they're maybe starting to worry a little bit or questioning things a little bit, when is a good time for a family to come to you for support? And, you know, how big do the changes need to be for some intervention to be warranted?
Yeah. And again, that follows really nicely from what we were just talking about, right? That prevention or early intervention is definitely better, and not waiting until things get really bad, right? So definitely doing that is a good call. I've actually been thinking recently about maybe some sort of preventative mental wellness support for people with Down syndrome who are new to adulthood, because we know that that's a really tricky time. So what if we just did like a little group program where we worked on, you know, making sure that we all have lots of activities going on, and that our self-esteem is at a healthy level, and that they have connections with one another, right? Because we know that's very protective in terms of mental health, if they can be connected with other people. So I think that, you know, would probably be a good idea. I think, though, I would be a bit remiss here if I don't say first that make sure you look at the physical health first, right? So if you're noticing behavioral changes or changes in mood or that kind of thing, you know, a whole myriad of physical health problems could cause that. So many of them relate to pain, and we know that people with Down syndrome may experience pain a little bit differently. They certainly may not express it when they're experiencing it. Don't forget about changes in sleep or diet or exercise levels, right? And a big change in routine for people who really thrive on routine, like people with Down syndrome, can definitely cause behavioral or mood changes. And a recent example of that is, you know, the start of the pandemic. where we did see a lot of regression in skills with some of the kids and, you know, behavioral changes that weren't so pleasing to parents, right?
Yeah.
So you've just got to kind of keep that stuff in mind first. But definitely I would say if you have concerns, I'm always willing to take calls or emails about that from families to see if, you know, intervention might be appropriate, or to talk through a couple strategies you could maybe try.
Yeah.
If you're noticing some of those changes.
For sure. Yeah. And you mentioned that, you know, you do notice that that transition from adolescence to adulthood is kind of when a lot of things can appear. Can you talk just a little bit more about why that is? What is it between that time?
Definitely. So, I mean, I think we suspect that it's because this routine, again, for people who really are super happy in their routines, the routine of school just suddenly ends, right? And even if, I mean, most parents are really great about getting their kids involved in other things right after high school. I don't think there's a lot of people with Down syndrome who are sitting alone on the couch at home for hours on end. I think they're all doing other things. But that sudden shift after, you know, how many years is that? It's it's the bulk of their lifetime, right? At that point. Yeah. And that's all of a sudden taken away with all of the social connections, right? These are people who really like to wave at people in the hallways and, you know, and be around other people and often be the center of attention. And now that daily opportunity is not there anymore. Yeah. So, you know, that I think is really hard on a lot of our young adults.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think just the fact that you're absolutely right with the routine and the structure, because so much of it is based on going to school every day. Then you're having these activities after school, then you have these activities on the weekend, but a lot of it just kind of falls by the wayside as soon as they're finished high school. And then it's like, okay, now what? Right. So yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's kind of dive into CBT specifically. So can you provide our listeners with a definition of CBT, and what are some of the basic principles behind this treatment approach?
Yes, absolutely. So CBT, or cognitive behavior therapy, is a highly effective therapeutic approach for all sorts of mental health issues. There's now, you know, a positively voluminous amount of gold standard research to show that it helps things like anxiety and depression in typically developing people. But it's also good to keep in mind that actually the principles of CBT, which I'll get into in a minute, actually apply to a lot of things that just affect human beings in general, right? So things like, you know, CBT principles are used with professional athletes, right? In terms of like sports, in terms of their training. Improving your effectiveness and satisfaction as a parent, or your self-confidence as a parent. That's been shown to be really helpful. And so I definitely include a CBT component in my parent training program, right? For parents of young kids with Down syndrome. Managing stressful situations better. So if you're somebody you feel you tend to overreact to small things, that CBT can be really helpful there. Insomnia, right? So I'm a notoriously poor sleeper, and my doctor recommended that I take this kind of self-directed CBT course online several years ago, and it was actually quite helpful, you know, for that. So CBT as a therapy is typically structured and time limited. So although it's a form of talking therapy, you know, I think a lot of us still have this picture in our heads of like the typical
couch.
You know, the couch,
lying on the couch,
right? You're lying on the couch, you're talking for like a whole hour, and there's the therapist like writing notes and maybe nodding off occasionally, and right, like it definitely doesn't really work that way. And and I think people also think of that as, I'm going to go see my therapist once a week for like my whole life, right? It goes on and on and on and on. Whereas CBT is a much more time limited approach. So for typically developing individuals, the treatment course may last weeks rather than months or years.
Interesting.
Right? And it can be quite helpful within a few weeks. So it's really problem solving focused. There's homework exercises each week. It's very directed by what the client's current issues are. There's not a lot of focus on like your past and what, kind of digging up past issues.
Solutions focused more than, Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So the main, not that I don't want to say there's anything wrong with that type of therapy, and that definitely has its place. I'm going to just put that out there too. Yeah. But that's not what CBT is. So the main concept underlying this kind of therapy is what's called the CBT Triad. And that's how your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors all impact one another. So it's a bit hard in a podcast scenario, but if you imagine a triangle, right? And at each point in the triangle, there's thoughts, and which is the cognition part, and there's behaviors or actions, and then the other point has your emotions or feelings. Yep. So those are the three. And then imagine kind of bidirectional arrows in between each one. So to show that your thoughts influence your behaviors, but actually your behaviors also influence your thoughts, right? So it all kind of works in this bidirectional way. Yep. And so I'll give you a specific example. So if I, see a cookie on a table, and it's available to me, and I think to myself, that cookie looks really delicious. I'd like to eat it. Yeah. And then I eat it, and that might make me feel happy. Yes. Right? Okay. But it could also work the other way. So the same situation, I now just see the cookie and don't think anything first. I just eat it. And then I think, oh man, I already ate 63 cookies for breakfast this morning. Why did I do that? I'm just a big pig, right? And then that's not going to make me feel happy, that thought. That thought is going to make me feel decidedly not very good about myself. Good about yourself, right? Exactly. So I'd feel pretty disappointed in myself. Yeah. So the point being that the relationship among the three things is this multi-directional thing. The goal of therapy, obviously, is to feel better. So when you do that by changing your thoughts and your behaviors, so that's the C and the B, right? The cognitions and the behaviors, so that your emotional state is less sad or less anxious and a little more, regulated, calm, happy, right? That's kind of what you're trying to get to. So regarding the cognitive part, we all have helpful and unhelpful thoughts. Okay. So there are a few problematic thought patterns, and the originator of cognitive therapy, Aaron Beck, essentially what he said about this is that we all make a lot of errors on a regular basis, some of us more than others, in interpreting events. So it's not an event itself that causes distress. It's how you interpret the event, right? Okay. And so a lot of us will have patterns like all or nothing thinking. So this would be something, you were mentioning earlier that a lot of our kids with Down syndrome tend to be a bit perfectionistic, right? And so they will not do something because they're afraid they're going to make a mistake. Yeah. So this is this kind of thought, if I'm not going to do it because I'm not going to do it right. Yeah. So I'm not going to do it at all. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I'm not even going to try. Or jumping to conclusions is another type of thinking. So one example of this that spouses really like to do to each other is mind reading. Like your spouse does something and you interpret it completely not the right way. Yes. Right? Oh, he's not talking to me right now, so he must be angry with me. Yeah. I must have done something wrong. Yeah. When in actual fact, maybe he's just tired. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So another really common one is catastrophizing or magnifying things. So this one I was thinking of what could be a specific example of this. And I feel like during COVID, anytime I got a sniffly nose, I was oh man. Yeah. Oh, I have COVID. Yes. Oh no, I'm going to get really sick. I won't be able to see my kids anymore. Yeah. Oh no. You know, so we kind of tend to jump to these we magnify something inappropriately. Yeah. So we've now made it much bigger. And you can imagine that thinking pattern, which happens very quickly in your brain, right? You go from 0 to 100, is not going to make me feel good about
Yeah.
the fact that I have the sniffles, it's
Yeah.
going to make me feel pretty lousy, right?
Yeah.
And very anxious. So
Yeah.
it's an example of an unhelpful thought.
Yeah.
So I don't know, Hina, if you resonate with any of those, or if there are any of those that you want to share.
I feel like I can resonate with all three of them at certain points in my life, because I feel like I've gone through all of them at a certain point. But I think the second one, in terms of interpreting incorrectly
Yes.
what someone else's, intention might be, is a big one. Where if I'm, for example, like if I'm sending a text message or, and I haven't heard back for 2 days. So there I could catastrophize and be like, oh, hopefully everything's okay. They haven't messaged me back. Like, are they sick? Are they dead? Or versus,
Yep, that's
are they mad
exactly
at
what
me?
that is.
Like, did I do something wrong?
Yeah.
And then I go through that pattern of like, I should have done this or that. So yeah, so I think those two for sure resonate with me quite a bit, because I feel like that is something that, and the funny thing is that, at least for me, I'm like, I know that I shouldn't be doing it, but it's so hard
Yes.
to get myself out of that cycle. So yeah.
Yeah. But being aware of it is a good thing. Yeah. But the point here is that everybody experiences
Yes,
them, right?
100%,
And that's kind of what you're trying to change. So one thing you would do, the goal here is to kind of modify or change those unhelpful thought patterns. So by cognitive reframing, so looking at it a different way. One way to do that is kind of, when I do this with kids, I will say, let's put our detective hats on, or be a scientist, whatever kind of resonates with them more. And like, let's find some evidence for that thought, right? Like, is there evidence out there that actually supports that, or no? And oftentimes there isn't. And then they think, oh, okay, maybe I don't need to jump to that particular conclusion.
Yeah.
And then regarding the behavior part, just to finish off the kind of the C and the B stuff, that might be more about like activity scheduling for somebody who's depressed. So making sure that they are now engaged in some of those activities that they used to find enjoyable but have stopped doing, even if it's in really small chunks and they just do a little bit every day. But definitely getting them active again is a big part of that. And then other behaviors, teaching active coping strategies for dealing with anxious or kind of low mood states. So developing and engaging in a relaxation routine, for example, those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, so, there is you mentioned that there's an abundance of research evidence that things like CBT work to reduce the effects of anxiety and depression in typically developing people. What about evidence as far as our individuals with Down syndrome? Does this work differently for them? Because a lot of the cognition, from my experience, it feels like it's quite high level. So it would, it's not necessarily very easy for them to get to. They might be able to with some support, but like, what's the research saying for Down syndrome and CBT effectiveness?
Right. So there definitely is now starting to be more research on whether CBT is effective in people with intellectual disabilities in general, though I haven't seen any that are specific to just people with Down syndrome, of course, because we know our population is really under-researched, a lot of these things. But I think, it really wasn't even considered, honestly, as a viable treatment option for people with intellectual disabilities until quite recently. Which is unfortunate, even though it's been around since the 60s.
And why do you think that they would not? Is it because of the intellectual disability part that they think they would not be able to?
It would, it might take longer. They wouldn't get the concept of thoughts, but people forget about the B, right? So, So, and then, there was one meta-analysis done in 2013 by Varinui and Langdon, and that a meta-analysis meaning that they summarized all the research that was out there already. They did find that CBT was moderately effective for treating anger problems and for depression in individuals with intellectual disabilities. So we do know that it works for people who have a cognitive disability. With respect to the actual, therapeutic process working differently, it definitely does. So I was saying before that it's a time-limited therapy, but in an individual with Down syndrome, it will take more time, right? Just because of, the
like
pace of their learning
and
you're starting at sometimes you have to start with a bit more psychoeducation type stuff than you would with that might take a bit longer than with a typically developing individual. Obviously, there's more visual supports, right? So there's a lot more of that kind of thing. And as Dr. Friedlander said on the podcast you did with him last season, CBT for people with Down syndrome is little c, big B, right? So meaning you don't focus so much on the cognitions, you focus more on the behavior. So that's basically what you can do there.
So, does it always have to take into account all three parts of the triad, or can it just be behavioral and emotional? Like, does cognition always have to play effect, whether it's big or small c? Or
there's definitely been one or two. Obviously my data pool here is small, right? Because I've only been doing this for a couple of years. But I would say there's been one or two teenagers who I have not done much cognition stuff with at all. It's been really mostly focused on the behavioral stuff. I mean, we kind of try sometimes, but it's definitely not. It's not as prominent.
And correct me if I'm saying this in the wrong way, but like sometimes the cognition aspect of it isn't as important depending on the anxiety that they're working through. So it doesn't matter as much.
Yeah, the point is you can definitely get some improvements by just modifying behavior and teaching coping skills and teaching them more emotional literacy.
Yes.
Right? You can definitely get somewhere just by doing those things for sure.
Yeah. The emotional literacy
part. So yes, you
part,
don't need the C part.
Yeah.
Is it helpful if the person is able to understand it? Yes,
absolutely.
I think it is. But
so, here at the DSRF, we observe a vast range of abilities in our students. Some are very chatty, some are, minimally verbal or maybe even nonverbal. And in talking about CB and the triad, does this change how effective CBT is? I mean, we kind of just touched on it a little bit, but can CBT be used for any individual with Down syndrome, no matter their learning profile or their language profile?
I think it can. I mean, I think you can definitely use it for kids who are minimally verbal.
Yeah.
Definitely. I do not think that they need to be able to identify thoughts, right? And talk about thought patterns at the way we were talking about them, like at that level that we were talking about them earlier. I don't think that's necessary at all. I think you can definitely make some changes with just working on the behavior modification aspect for sure.
Yeah. And that's actually really good to know, because I think parents and people that work with individuals with Down syndrome are listening and saying, because it seems very higher order CBT, but will it work for our people? And it can. It's just how you approach it with them is kind of what you have to think about.
I also think I would also add there that with those, with the teens and adults, and it is mostly teens and adults I've seen. I don't think I've seen anybody under age 14 maybe is the youngest I've seen. But for the teens who are minimally verbal, parents' involvement is especially important, right? Because you also want to make sure that parents understand the principles of when to apply the strategies, when to bring out making sure you don't bring out those, because I give them choice boards of things that I can do to make myself feel better if I'm getting angry, making sure that parents are pulling that out at the right time. So we know that you have to give the kids that as the anger is just getting going. You cannot do it if they've already started kicking walls and punching things, and because A, they won't be able to process that information, and B, now you're reinforcing positive or problem behavior,
Yeah,
right? Because
yeah.
they are now,
Getting your attention.
and they've wrecked things and right. So, and now you're giving them a choice of like, ooh, I can do some deep breathing. I mean, that's just not, or other reinforcing activities, right?
Yeah.
So making sure that parents are really, really involved. I mean, I think parents have to be involved with all of them.
Yeah.
For sure. I don't think I've done any therapy with anybody whose parents weren't involved at all.
Yeah.
But it's especially important with those kids.
Yeah. And then and I think it's so great because, we do talk about preventative strategies for problem behavior. So I think it's the same idea. Like you need to maybe use preventative strategies to help with coping with, anxiety and depression. So you're kind of trying to come at it before it gets to the point where then it's not.
So for example, with lots of kids, that is so for kids who are prone to low mood or depression, that is that kind of idea of activity scheduling, right? And making sure there's lots of fun things in their day, so that they don't, go down that route. And for kids who are more towards the anxious or anger side of things, which can often go together, you want to make sure that you teach them a relaxation routine, right? That they engage in once a day or once every couple of days on a regular preventative basis.
And the activity schedule thing resonates so well with me as an OT because a big proponent of our profession is that, to help with mental health and to improve and maintain your mental health, you need to have, quote unquote, occupations to occupy your time throughout the day. And there's research that has shown that for people with mental health challenges, when they have something to occupy them throughout the day, for somebody who may have issues with auditory hallucinations and is schizophrenic, it's reduced quite a bit because they have other things occupying their mind, right?
Yeah, so that's a great example. And think about all of us at the beginning of the pandemic when we were stuck at home.
Yeah.
Right. And 100%. Our routine was all of a sudden taken away from us. I mean, the kids with Down syndrome aside, who it definitely negatively impacted. But it was hard for all of us, right? Because if you are kind of left with nothing to do and, before we all started pulling out puzzles and lengthy books and that kind of thing, when you're just left to your own devices, your thoughts will get away from you and that will impact your mood negatively.
100%. Absolutely.
So having things scheduled in that keep you busy and that are fun. So these aren't just kind of, busy work activities, right? These are things like
enjoyable activities.
Enjoyable activities. And I like to think of it in terms of, I read some time ago about that activities should be both pleasurable or involve mastery, right? So either something you really like or something you're really good at. And so it should have at least one of those components.
And I think just for overall, for like improving cognition and, decreasing cognitive decline, it's so important to like you're learning new things. So you're building new connections. So it's really impacting so many different areas of your mental health and your cognitive health, right? So
that's a good point, especially for a population of people that's prone to developing dementia.
Exactly.
Too, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Can you walk us through the process of what happens when someone comes to see you? Do you have an assessment procedure first? And how do you decide where to kind of go first?
So I definitely start with the assessment process with parents. So that includes kind of current issues their child's having, always like a family history of mental health issues, because Down syndrome or not, if someone in your family, especially your immediate family, has a mental health issue, then your children are more likely to have it as well. We go through the relevant sections of a really well accepted assessment tool called the ADIS, so Anxiety Disorders Interview Schedule. This one particular one is designed for children and teens and their parents. So there's specific questions about things like, depression and the different types of anxiety and ADHD and obsessive compulsive disorder, whatever the parent is most concerned about. I will make it clear right here, though, that even though I've received that training, I'm not able to make a formal diagnosis. diagnosis.
Yes.
So if a parent were to want that formal diagnosis, they would have to see a psychiatrist or a registered clinical psychologist.
Yeah.
And then after I'm done, with the parents, that usually takes kind of a session. I start assessing the teen or adult. I find out from their perspective, like what they're worried about or what their concerns are. I adapt relevant portions of that assessment, the ADIS. And, those adaptations, of course, include modifying the language because even though it's designed for kids, I still have to further modify the language. Yeah. That's where it's really helpful to be an SLP by trade, right?
Yes, exactly.
As well as adding in some visual supports. So, examples would be like photos of emotions instead of just, are you feeling sad? Or rating scales for how sad or nervous you're feeling. So it's really important so that we get accurate information, because oftentimes if you ask an individual with Down syndrome, do you ever feel worried or do you ever feel sad? They'll be like, no.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because as we know, they just kind of tend to say no to a lot of things.
Yes.
So, and also they may even not want to admit that they're feeling that way. That can be, I think, sometimes the issue too, that they don't want to admit that they're
Think of it as a bad thing if they admitted it, right?
Yeah, a little bit. So it could be one of those things. But so if I ask a kid who comes to me, if I say, are you afraid of bees? She might just say, no, I'm not. But if I just put a picture of a bee on the table and she sort of like recoils in horror, then I have my answer without actually having to have had to ask the verbal question, right? Which we know is sometimes a better way of doing things with this population of kids. And then once I've got that information, I might then give them the ADIS has like a thermometer type scale that I've modified a little bit. So, if the level is really low on the thermometer, it's kind of like, I'm not scared at all. Or if it's like way up at the top, then I'm really, really, really super duper terrified of that bee, right? So, at that point, I definitely also try to get an idea of their emotional literacy. So like, can they label their own emotions? Can they tell me about the emotions of other people? How many of the emotion words do they recognize and know? Can they identify why a person is feeling a particular way or what makes them feel a particular way? And then that idea again of like, how willing are they to admit that they don't feel good? Because lots of them say they're happy, even when it's clear that they aren't.
They're not.
Right? So especially in front of parents, honestly, that's definitely a thing. And then last with as kind of the first step of assessment with these guys is, do they have any coping strategies? So if I show them a picture of like a sad kid and I ask them like, how could we make them feel better? They'll either say, I don't know, or, they might give me a strategy, right? So, and lots of them will say, I give them a hug, which is very lovely. So, and then as kind of a secondary thing, if the teen or adult has relatively strong verbal skills, then that may go on a bit longer. So because they, maybe are able to because they have these relatively well-developed verbal skills, I might try to ascertain how aware they are of thought patterns then at that point too, right? So interestingly, with telehealth, one new way I figured out how to do this is by having the person play a relatively difficult game. So like the CBC, have you used the CBC Kids website? And they have those hockey games on there or the soccer games. And they're kind of like these skill things where they have to shoot a puck at a net. And it's kind of hard to get the hang of it. They eventually do, but at the beginning, it's quite hard to get the hang of it. And they also, it's time pressured and it's like competitive because they're trying to beat my score, right? So I pay attention then to their self-talk. So some of them will be like, they'll just shoot the thing. And if they miss, they're like, oh, well. And then they shoot and they get a goal and they say, oh, good job. I'm amazing. I'm so great. And then I'm like, okay, well, clearly you have fairly good self-confidence here. And maybe not such unhelpful thought patterns around this anyway. But interestingly, surprisingly, some of the adults or teens will say things like, oh, that was dumb. Or, oh, I always do that. I always make that mistake. Right? So then that kind of clues me into, what else are you doing in your life where you're using that kind of language, which is clearly unhelpful.
Yeah. And most likely there are other ways or other parts of their life where that's happening. Because if it's happening in this one context, most likely it is in others.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You got it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's basically what assessment looks like, I would say.
Yeah.
And assessment with the kids can take several sessions.
Okay.
Right?
I was just going to ask. Okay.
Yeah. That can take quite a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned early on that the ADIS is obviously for kids and teens, but not for kids and teens with Down syndrome. And I think there's really no assessment out there, I don't think that I know of, that uses, Down syndrome as its like norm population or developer.
No.
But I love that you also have kind of like this other informal way of assessing things as well, because then you get a better picture overall of how they're coping and what their unhelpful thought patterns are and everything. So you get a better picture of the person overall rather than just relying on the ADIS itself, right? Like there's all these other things you put in place.
And if you think about it, we've talked about this lots of times as therapists in many different disciplines or teachers here, right? We were talking about it earlier today.
Yes.
That, structured assessments, standardized formal assessing does not work well with our kids. They tend to not do well at it. They tend to get discouraged, and then you don't get accurate information. Yeah. Plus you can't compare them to a peer group that's relevant. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Can you share with us? So we've talked about assessment. So when you come, so you have a component where you talk to the parents, then you have a bigger component where you're working with your clients and assessing them. So once a goal is established, like obviously the goals are established with you talking to the parents, maybe also including your client, depending on age level, like what do you want to work on? How often do you get your kiddos with Down syndrome telling you, like, I want to overcome this? Like, does that happen a lot, or is it mostly mediated with parents?
I would say if I give them choices, then they're able to tell me. But I don't think I've ever, maybe I've had a couple say like, I want to something specific. I want to be happier, or I'm not a happy guy. I want to be a happy guy.
Got it.
Right? Like that kind of thing. Yeah. I've had a couple say that. But usually it's more of a choice. Like, do you want to work on this or this? Or what do you want to get better at? What will make you feel better? And then I give them kind of choices. Yeah. Yeah.
And how long do you feel like the next question I'm going to ask about some treatment ideas, but like what's the general amount of time that it would take to kind of from beginning to end to help? I mean, I know it's very unique to each individual, but like, could it go on for months?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So I've definitely been seeing, again, it's so hard to give like an average or anything like that. It depends on how severe the behavior or the behavior and the issues are at the beginning. Yeah. That then it will definitely take longer. I would say that, some of the kids I've seen took about, 9 months or a year. Yeah. And then there's some who I started seeing near the beginning who I'm still seeing. Even if it's like on a monthly basis. Yeah. Right? Just because, they just had things that were a little more intensive. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Makes sense. So now that we've kind of assessed, we figured out what the goal is. So can you share with us some examples of treatments that you might employ with somebody that you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the first thing, maybe I could give you a couple guiding principles first. Yes. One of them we've kind of talked about already, which is getting the parents involved. So both because I want them to be using the strategies at home, but also because, getting regular updates from them is really important for me so that I can work on things that are currently relevant and check in about what strategies are helping and which ones aren't, right? Yeah. So I need to know that information. You're often seeing them
like once a week, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
Usually once a week. That's right. Yeah. And so the therapy session definitely has to have some structure. So, I do have a couple of adults who are extremely chatty, but with the exception of those guys, which is, it's not like a regular talk therapy counseling session, what most people would think of as a counseling session. That's not going to fly with most of these guys. No. So it tends to definitely be a mix of kind of shorter, quicker activities with a lot of they choose what's going on. Games, videos. I end up showing a lot of that Inside Out movie. And then clips also from their favorite movies so that we can, I watched some Harry Potter last week, right? Mm-hmm. And Harry's really angry in this episode or in this movie. What could he do to make himself feel better?
What is Harry's coping strategy?
And actually, the young man that I was working with had a really great idea. He's like, well, he should just go upstairs and go and pet Hedwig and that will make him feel better, his owl. Yes. And I was like, that would make him feel better. Yes. That's a very good idea. Yes. So getting them to kind of apply the strategies, right? Actively and not just talking about it. And then movement breaks, which I know as an OT you're a very big fan of. And of course, with this population of people, that does tend to fall to the dance party kind of side of things.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and along that lines, the therapy has to be fun and engaging, right? So, and mental health is serious, and there have definitely been tears in my sessions on both sides, right? There are sad things that happen and that get talked about.
Yeah.
But honestly, most of the teaching stuff has definitely got to be, it's got to be fun, both for the kids who are experiencing low mood, because we want to have as many opportunities as possible to make them feel better, to raise that mood and show them that it's, that you can laugh and you can have a good time and all that kind of stuff. As well as for the ones who are really anxious and they just need to feel a bit more comfortable, right? And humor generally puts people at ease, especially people with Down syndrome. I would say they really like that. And we also know that fun increases engagement with the material, and that helps learning. So those are kind of the general guiding principles. And then what a therapy session itself looks like and kind of the goals that are addressed, it depends a bit on what's going on with the particular person and their own unique skill set. But definitely that emotional literacy piece, so the identification and expression of emotion words, that often includes the zones of regulation framework, which I have found I haven't used it with everybody, but I've used it with a lot of the kids because they, the teens and adults, because it's really the fact that it's visual and it's color coded, and we have now all collectively as a group at DSRF, we've modified it nicely so that it works really well with our kids. But that idea of teaching them how to regulate their emotions or their sensory needs and that kind of thing so that they're functioning at this kind of calm, happy state rather than too low or too ramped up.
For sure.
Right? Yeah. Definitely there's teaching. I try to do this early on. So we were saying earlier, yes, it can take a really long time, right? This kind of therapy with individuals with Down syndrome. But I think, one thing that I try to do is get at some coping strategies really early. So, making sure that we have things in place fairly early on that are going to make them feel better. So definitely teaching them coping skills for uncomfortable feeling states. So for kids who are quick to be anxious or they're quick to become angry, there's definitely a lot of deep breathing, mindfulness, going on a mental vacation. That's very fun. That's something that actually all of us might want to do during COVID, because we can't go on a real vacation. But I'll get the person's mom to send me a photo of the last place they went on vacation or the person's favorite place to go on vacation. We spend some time talking about the picture, what does it smell like there? What does it look like? What kinds of things do you see?
Such a good idea.
And
I love that.
They really get into it actually. And then they sort of sit back in their chair with their hands behind their head and they lean back and close their eyes. And then I kind of take them through, imagine you're walking along the beach. And that's really, a lot of them really like that. We also often will do yoga poses together, that kind of thing for kids who are anxious. calming scents. So like smelling, we do lots of smell experiments. Like, does vanilla make me feel calm or does coffee make me feel calm? Like, obviously that's usually vanilla for most people. So that kind of thing. And then for kids who are experiencing low mood, we actually do the opposite. So like, what kinds of music or what kinds of scents wake you up, right? Or make you feel less sad, make you feel more happy. Dance parties, watching cute kittens on YouTube, right? That's always a good thing. And then for teens, so those things that I've mentioned already would be applicable to like all kids with Down syndrome, right? So that would definitely, those would definitely be, I've used those with everybody. That is definitely an everybody thing, even kids who are minimally verbal or younger. So for teens or adults who are more verbal and are kind of able to identify some thinking patterns and get that, because it's a concept, right? That we have words that happen inside our head. So, and it's a tough one.
Seems very nebulous, but
it is. But for those young people, I would teach them the CBT Triad that we talked about earlier. And then we would talk about how having helpful thoughts can either help our behavior and our emotions, or the flip side, how having unhelpful thoughts definitely is not great for either feelings or behavior. So one, we call this talking back to your fear. Right? Like just giving it to it. Like,
letting it have it.
Letting it have it. Exactly. But one example would be a kid who's, really afraid of needles. Right? And if you think about the needle and you think, it's going to hurt, it's going to be awful, there's going to be blood, then that's going to not make you feel very calm, right? It's going to make you feel more anxious. And for most kids, that's going to make them run out of the lab, right? So, but if you instead think to yourself, I can do this. I got this. I did this last year. It's fine. It's only going to take a minute, right? And we actually write all these things out and how that's going to help you stay there and get it done. And I don't ever pretend that you're not going to be nervous. But I'm going to say you might be a little less nervous.
But you can
might
cope with that
nervousness. More calm. So that's a specific
I love that.
example.
So you call that talking back to your fear?
Yeah,
I feel like we could all use that strategy for sure.
You could.
Yeah,
you definitely could.
I could talk back to some spiders and bugs in my apartment.
You could. Yeah, you should. You should talk back to the spiders and the bugs. And then, so for people, again, with more language and more of that kind of metacognitive awareness ability and who are experiencing anxiety, I would also do some psychoeducation around like the fight, flight, freeze response, right? And how that can be, that happens, how anxiety feels physiologically in our bodies, right? There's a reason why you're getting an upset tummy before you have to go to school because you're feeling anxious about it. And then, that idea of real versus false alarm. So lots of times what I'll say is, our brains and bodies sometimes act like there's a bear running towards us, even though it's actually a cute, fluffy white dog, right? But our bodies make us think that it's like something very scary because you're feeling anxious. And then one more fun concept that I really like working on regarding behavioral modification. So is the idea of spiral up and spiral down. So this is basically some things we do as humans cause our mood to spiral up and make us feel more happy. And some things we do make us spiral downwards and make us feel sad or tired or gross. Right? So we know that this well, Hannah, that, our kids really enjoy role play, right? So they really like watching us engage in it or participating in it. And so if I role play it and kind of draw it for the teens and adults, they really get this concept. So it's a good way to teach things that are not very ideas that are not very popular, such as, you feel good if you watch one TV show, but But if you watch 8 in a row, that makes you feel pretty crummy. Yeah. And that is not a popular idea. And I get a lot of pushback, and so do parents. But they kind of get it if you draw it out this way. Right? And if I act out how gross I feel. So the last one I did was with, I did it with chocolate. Like if you eat one piece of chocolate, you know, I ate a little piece of chocolate and I was like, ooh, that was nice. I feel good. Yeah. And then I happened to have, because I was at home, so I happened to have like a super huge piece of baking chocolate, just a giant one. Yeah. And I like pretended to just gulp it all down. And then I acted very, you know, obviously sluggish, tired, not happy. And the person that I was working with thought that was very hilarious. And it really, you know, drove the concept home, I would say, for sure. Yeah. So anyway, that's basically
and I love how all of these are so visual based, right? Because that there is one of the many strengths of our individuals with Down syndrome is that they are, especially when you were talking about the mental vacation thing, and they have very strong visual memory, so they can go back to that time when they were happy on the Disney cruise, and they can use that memory maybe as a way to help cope with anxiety that might be happening in the moment, right? Yeah. So I was thinking a little bit earlier that another strength of our individuals with Down syndrome is that they're highly empathetic. They're very sensitive. So like, do you feel like that plays a role in how they are expressing their anxiety or feeling their anxiety because of that sensitivity that they have to others' emotions? But like, is it internally, are they sensitive more to their emotions and that's why it's harder? Or
I mean, I think that's a really good point to bring up, and it's one we talk about a lot, right? Because and especially at this time, it's one that I've been telling parents about a lot. Like, you are stressed right now. Yeah. Whether you are trying to cover it up in front of your kids or not, your kid with Down syndrome is going to pick up on it. Yeah. And that is not going to bode well for things like anxiety, depression, and problem behavior. So now there's also a fine line there, because not trying to make parents feel guilty or feel like, you know, oh my gosh, like, why am I have to stop being so stressed around my kids. Or like
withhold my stress in so that,
So you don't want to do that. You just need to find the parent then needs to find productive ways to deal with the stress so that it's not so apparent to your kid. Because it definitely does. They 100% pick up on it. Yeah. And it can exacerbate their own anxiety or depression for sure. Yeah.
And I think that would be a great episode topic for a future. We're going to have you back again and again, because there's so much awesome stuff that you have for us. But I think like the parent side would be really interesting to kind of delve into.
Oh, yes. I love talking about that.
Yeah. Like how you're going to train parents and kind of help them, you know, take care of themselves so that they can also, right?
Yes. Because as we were talking about earlier, all those unhelpful thinking styles, boy, have I heard some doozies from parents over the years. Yeah. You know, about the kinds of thoughts they think about themselves as parents. Yeah. Right. Oh. And they can benefit from this same stuff. Yeah. Right. They can reframe their thoughts. In fact, it'll be easier for them. Right. Because they don't have a cognitive disability. So, yeah. Yeah.
And then kind of just to end things, I was curious. So obviously you create coping strategies for your clients in a way that they will be able to independently deploy them themselves when they need it.
Ideally, but it takes a while to get there.
Perfect. That's what I was wondering. Yeah. Because that's why the parent involvement is so important as well, because that support is still needed for them as they're learning.
That's right.
So the reminders and the visuals and all that, because
you got it.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah. Our last question of the day, you mentioned so many amazing resources, and I'm writing some stuff down and we'll put it on our episode page, but are there some of your go-to resources that you'd like our listeners to check out to kind of find out a little bit more about CBT and anxiety? And
yeah, so specific to CBT, the Anxiety Canada website is phenomenal. It's a really wonderful resource for parents and professionals. There's actually kind of self-guided CBT programs for both adults and kids on there. Amazing. And I've used them quite a bit. Yeah. They've developed an app, which I think is on both Android and iPhone. that's called the Mind Shift app that I use quite a bit because it actually it's free. So you know how things like Calm and Headspace, they're wonderful, but they're expensive.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but this app actually has some mindfulness practices. It has guided mental vacations. It has progressive muscle relaxation exercises.
Yes.
It has like check-ins about how you're feeling today and all sorts of other helpful tools.
Amazing.
That, and again, it's for free. So that's definitely a good one.
Yeah.
And then another one, just if you're curious about like what are you want more information about like what are some of the mental health issues for people with Down syndrome, there is a book called Mental Wellness in Adults with Down syndrome. It's actually now out of print.
I heard about that.
Yeah. I don't know why, because it's a good book, but it's a great overview with lots of specific examples. And we do have quite a few copies here at DSRF. So if somebody wanted to borrow it, they could definitely do that.
Fantastic.
So those are probably and of course the zones of regulation.
Yes.
Right. That's another one. Although again, you might want to kind of get that from a therapist because again, we've adapted it a lot.
Yeah.
Right. Like I ended up putting instead of the boring line drawings, zones of regulation.
Those drawings are not good.
It's a wonderful program, but the line drawings they're hard. I can't even tell the facial expressions
they're way
apart.
Too nuanced.
So I actually had Asia recently, our teaching assistant extraordinaire here at DSRF. She actually made me one that has emojis for each zone. So, and like, there's like a poo emoji that's swearing in the red zone, right? Like it's very, she did a really good job.
Yeah. Great.
So make sure if you're going to use the zones of regulation, I would suggest going through your therapist to do it or your teacher.
SLP or OT teacher or you. Yeah. 100%. Great. And then you were also talking about Headspace and Calm. And I mean, there's so many different mindfulness apps as well that you can check out. So as we end things, is there any like last advice that you want to give to our parents that are probably a little concerned about this, or they're like, okay, like what would you say to them as your parting words?
I mean,
it's a heavy question because there's so many parting words, but
I mean, I think definitely if you do have concerns, then definitely talk to somebody about it. Don't wait, for sure. Yeah. But on the other hand, know that there are lots of things that you can do preventatively, some of which I already talked about, and some of which are just kind of really good things to do with your kids. Yeah. And that is making sure you have a strong bond with your kid, right? Playing with them lots and not trying to teach them all the time. That's going to help them develop into, self-confident individuals, right? Just trying to do everything you can to bolster their self-esteem from an early age. And, everybody who knows me well knows that my favorite thing in the whole world is positive reinforcement, right? And so the more of that you can give your child, the better off their mental health will be, right? Making sure that they have things that they are good at and that they have a chance to engage in those things regularly. And maybe the last thing being make sure that they have lots of, COVID aside, lots of social opportunities, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This has been a really, really informative episode. I mean, I knew a little bit about CBT, but I feel like I have learned so much more, not only to use for myself, but, now
you can go and tackle those magnification, catastrophizing thoughts
and then
you were
maybe those
having.
Spiders as well, I'll talk back to later on. But but thank you so much for joining us again. And we're excited to have you back again for season 4. And we can talk about lots of other really fun stuff. So thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Thanks.